Greeting viewers, we hope you are well and in good health. It's a pleasure to have you join us again today on our ongoing book talk series. Today we feature yet another dynamic book by one of our most respected African authors and educators. Before we get the show going, I would like to highlight that this program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, Columbia Global Centers Nairobi. You're welcome to review the book series playlist at your pleasure. As we proceed, please post your questions under the Q&A section. The moderator will direct them to the author at the end of the session. Kindly follow us on social media. That way you will not miss out on any of our upcoming programs. Our handles are CGC Nairobi for Twitter and Facebook. For Instagram, it's cgc.nairobi. I would now like to hand over to our director, Dr. Murugi Dirango, to open the session. Welcome, Dr. Dirango.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Greetings and welcome to our audience. We are delighted that you are joining us today. As Pauline has said, my name is Murugi Dirango and I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers, Nairobi. CGC Nairobi is one of 9 centers established by Columbia University to create opportunities for shared learning and deepen the nature of global dialogue. Today, we are delighted to host another event in our series of virtual book talks featuring African authors. The series offers a platform where African writers can engage a global audience, discussing their work and exciting perspectives on how personal, political, and cultural experiences drive their storytelling. Today's talk will feature Professor Mahmood Mamdani discussing his new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, published by the Harvard University Press. Dr. Mshai Mwangola will moderate today's talk. Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University in New York. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974, and specialized in studying African history and politics. His works explore the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Before joining the Columbia faculty, Mamdani was a professor at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania between 1973 and 1979, Makerere University in Uganda 1980 and 1993, and the University of Cape Town between 1996 and 1999. He has received numerous awards and recognitions, including being listed as one of the top 20 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines in 2008. From 1998 to 2002, he served as president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, otherwise known as CODESRIA. His essays have appeared in the New Left Review and the London Review of Books, among other journals. Professor Mamdani is a friend and advisor to the Nairobi Global Center, having served on our faculty advisory committee in the past. And therefore, we are really, truly delighted to have him speak in this event. We will share a link to his full bio in the chat box because, as you can tell, I have not done much justice to it. There's a lot more about the professor that I would like you to look at that link and understand and see all the things that he's done. I will now introduce our moderator for today's event. Mshai Mwangola holds a PhD in performance studies from Northwestern University in the US. Her thesis on Kenya's Uhuru generation, titled Performing Our Stories, Performing Ourselves, approaches the idea of a generational historical mission through the recreation, invocation, and facilitation of performance as a site of individual and communal reflection. Before this, she obtained a Master's of Creative Arts from the School of Studies in the Creative Arts, University of Melbourne in Australia, and a Bachelor of Education Honours from Kenyatta University in Kenya. Let me now invite Mshai to moderate the event. Welcome, Mshai.
Thank you very, very much, Murugi. And indeed, I join you in saying it is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be hosting somebody whom I consider as a mentor. And in the words of one of our participants, Costa Mulea, who says, Professor Mamdani, you are our role model. And I just want to echo that as I say, welcome, Prof. It's such a joy to have you. Even before I invite you to say anything, and I'm really pleased to see how well you are looking, I wanted to just start by giving people just a tiny taste of this book that we are going to be discussing, Neither Native Nor Settler. I have been neither settler nor native. I think of the native first, and maybe we'll discuss why that is. But I've been reading this book over the last couple of months, and I think we have had a conversation about this, just thinking through the many things that it does, but most importantly, the challenge that you give us to think forward. So normally when we start with just the first few words of a book, but I thought that this time for a change, I'll just start by giving you 2 or 3 minutes of the final chapter, which is entitled Decolonizing the Political Community, just as a space for us to begin to think about what the whole conversation, to set us up for what this conversation will be. So this will just be a couple of minutes, decolonizing the political community from neither settler nor native, the making and unmaking of permanent minorities. We live in an era of civil war and genocide, both occurring mainly in former colonial countries. This extreme violence has marked the period after independence more than the colonial era. The violence has not focused on the social question. The violence was not revolutionary. The oppressed social classes have not risen up against the rich. The lines of division were political rather than social. On one side were those who claimed the independent state as the patrimony of the nation. On the other were those politically excluded. The division was internal, not between inside and out. But while the violence exploded after independence in Sudan, Rwanda, Congo, Somalia, Angola, Mozambique, Algeria, and elsewhere, the genesis lay in the colonial period. To recognize this is to deepen our understanding of the political challenge at independence. It is to acknowledge that the political effect of colonialism was not limited to the loss of external independence, to the drawing of external borders that demarcated the colony from the outside. Most importantly, colonial governance drew borders inside the colony. These boundaries separated races and created homelands for ethnic groups, turning them into administratively demarcated tribes. Writers on African affairs often bemoan the artificial nature of boundaries drawn by colonial powers, artificial in that they cut across cultural communities. This criticism reinforces colonial modernist ideology by suggesting that internal boundaries between ethnic groups, territorialized as tribes, was somewhat natural. Yet, the ethnic nations these writers cherish did not necessarily exist as territorialized groups before colonialism. Ethnic political communities were created by colonizers, drawing lines between culturally distinct peoples and subjecting them to law said to be customary. The tribal governance that activists seek to protect reflects the politicization of cultural identity. These are not political communities of pre-colonial times. The challenges facing anti-colonialists then is to reimagine political community without colonial categories and reform politics on this basis. This is the challenge of decolonizing the political, stripping away the nation or the tribe as nation as a locus of political identification and commitment. Prof, I wanted to start with that because as I read it, you just explored. It was like you were exploding one thing after the other of things that some of us hold very dear. Those of us who are involved in activism, the whole space of the nation with regard to the politics, we all think about the nation state. But I really, really like that you come towards the end of this book. And on one hand, you're pointing us forward. But for me, it also seemed that you really want us to understand the past that we have come from. And so I wanted to invite you to say, welcome, Prof, because I really like what you're doing with this book. I like the way that you're taking us through the past, making us look at the present, but always with the focus on the future. So karibu. And let me start right off by asking, why is it so important for you for us to reform the political community? I'm going to ask the question right from the beginning.
Thank you, Mshai. And thank you everybody who is listening, even though faceless. You can see me, but I can't see you. But that's the new world, I guess. So, you know, I came to political maturity in the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, when I began to do my first academic job at the University of Dar es Salaam, I was part of the first generation of post-colonial African intellectuals. And we believed that now that colonialism was over, we would enter a new world. And in this new world, there would be no violence. Or, let me say, the only violence would be either revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. It would be a necessity as we march to a newer world, a better world, where we would fight, having achieved political independence, we would now fight for social justice. So violence would be revolutionary, or it would be counter-revolutionary. And then came the Rwanda Genocide. It was like a terrible nightmare, but which woke us up from the dream that we were living. And we realized we couldn't make sense of this violence. I remember we had a meeting in Arusha. Codesria called that meeting, 1994. And over 100 of us gathered. So the question was, how do we make sense? Close to 1 million people had been killed. The Western writers were telling us, see, this confirms that Africa is a continent of tribes. Tribes always fight one another. Tribes have never learned how to live with one another unless there's a referee from the outside, unless there are peace brokers and peacemakers, and unless that, we'll just be having one wave of violence after another. Actually, they concluded Colonialism ended too early. It should have gone on. This was, I'm not exaggerating at all. This was the nature of public discourse. Now, it was clear to me that you could not explain this violence as class violence. In particular places, individual locality, yes, you could argue, as some did, that those who killed then took the land and distributed it amongst themselves. But it was not a violence of the rich against the poor. It was a violence of Hutu against Tutsi. Now, I wrote a book about it, and in my book, I decided to historicize this because the first question I came up with was that I could not find a single instance of Hutu and Tutsi fighting one another as Hutu and as Tutsi before colonialism.
This is when victims became killers?
Yeah, when victims became killers. I couldn't come across a single instance. So I asked myself, why? And I realized that this is because the nature of governance changed. I had to look from the marketplace to the state, the nature of the colonial state. And I had to realize that the colonial state integrated Hutu and Tutsi on completely different terms within the colonial space. If you were Hutu, you were indeed the most oppressed. And if you were Tutsi, you were oppressed, but you were relatively a little less oppressed. The chiefs came from the Tutsis. The Tutsis went to schools where they learned in French. The Hutus went to schools where they learned in Kiswahili. And since French was the language of officialdom, only Tutsi could get access to official jobs, so on and so forth. And I realized that the kind of dress rehearsal to the 1994 genocide was the 1959 revolution, where the majority fought the minority and seized power. But the perverseness of this development was that the majority saw itself as Hutu, and they saw the minority as Tutsi, because they had been excluded as Hutu. And since then, I mean, I have worked on a number of places which have been sites of extreme violence, whether it's been Darfur or South Sudan or South Africa. And I realized that the violence is always between those who consider themselves the nation and those who exclude others from the nation, even if these others are born there, generations on, but on one ground or another, they have been excluded. So that was the beginning of my journey.
Prof, you've said some things, and the reason I asked that question is that I was thinking back the other work, and I know there's a lot of other books you've written, a lot of articles, there's been a lot of debates that you've been part of. And I wanted us to touch on that because it seems to me that this book comes out of a lot of previous work, a lot of deep thinking. You have mentioned one book, but also that this book comes out of saying that the problem is not the problem of one country where there's a bad person, or, you know, as people often say, Africans are just cursed with bad leadership. But you're saying there is a fundamental problem in the very nature of the political framework that we have. And I just had wanted, the reason I asked that question was it seemed to me that one of the richest things about the book is that it's building on previous work where you have gone really in depth into So, you've mentioned when victims become killers, you've really looked into the situation in Rwanda. I know you've also done some work in South Sudan, and I'm going to ask you if you could say just a little bit about that, because it comes, I think, both from working as an academic, sitting back, doing the research, but also getting right into the thick of things, right? And engaging with people on the ground, as your work was with the AU, and then saying, let's look at the two terms that you have thrown out. First of all, the question of extreme violence, not just violence, but we have extreme violence. What's wrong with this? How is it that we keep coming into this space of these cycles of extreme violence? And then also looking at this question of, if then the problem is the question of the state, what is it about the state where people within the state are people who say that we are all one happy country, we still think of ourselves as belonging to certain minorities or majorities. So that was why I asked you the question that I asked. And now as we go and start to think through the book, I was wondering if you could just take us to one of the other case studies in terms of the previous work that you've done, because it also comes up in this book, and I'll go to some of the case studies here, which is that you went to South Sudan and you actually were part of a commission thinking through the issue that were there. Could you say just a little bit about that work?
Sure. I'd love to say something about two cases. South Sudan is one of them, and South Africa is another. So South Sudan, we had this commission of 5 of us. And we were looking at extreme violence, meaning that we were looking at violence which you can't make sense of if you reduce it to an individual level. Because people were being killed, not as individuals, as groups, and groups were being identified in terms of the identities they belong to. Also, the violence was not a standalone violence. It was a violence which went in cycles. And if it went in cycles, quite often victims and perpetrators tended to trade places. In the Rwanda Genocide, when I did interviews in Rwanda, I would often find that the same person, the same Hutu person who had killed Tutsi in one place was rescuing Tutsi in another place. And I really couldn't make sense of this. Very often people traded places, victims and perpetrators. Now, there is a standard formula, which is the International Criminal Court formula, which comes from Nuremberg. And the Nuremberg formula is that all violence must be traced to the perpetrator, and every perpetrator must be held responsible individually. Now, the problem is that when you have violence on such a scale, you're not going to get anywhere by identifying perpetrators. I mean, in Germany, they identified over 1 million. And General Eisenhower said it will take us 50 years to hold them accountable in court. The outcome was perverse. They just kept on freeing them one after another, and eventually they began to rehire them, and eventually they go to Germany, where the former Nazis were back in leading positions. So our commission in South Sudan divided on how do we move forward? What is the solution? The majority in the commission said the solution is criminal justice, meaning we identify the perpetrators and we take them to court, to the International Criminal Court, the worst of the perpetrators. And my view was that this will not get us anywhere.
Yeah.
We will just be set up for the next cycle of violence because perpetrators are not alone. Perpetrators have constituencies, and constituencies are mobilized around issues. And we have to identify the issues, and we have to address the issues, not go to court.
Mm.
And I held up South Africa as an example, because even though there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the TRC was based on the Nuremberg model, which is identify individual perpetrators, but not hold them accountable, but basically pardon them, forgive them. I don't believe the TRC got us anywhere. What got us ahead was not the TRC, but it was the political negotiations between different political sides. So it was constituencies. And the Kempton Park talks had to identify the issues around which constituencies were mobilized. And the first thing they had to do was to reform the political system. But they did not succeed in reforming the political system fully. What they did succeed in, the half that they reformed had to do with race. So they removed the racial qualifications in the franchise, the racial qualifications in the courts, the legal system, the political system. So formally, they deracialized it. But what they did not do was detribalize the system colonialism had created, which is colonialism did not create ethnic groups. But what they did do was they identified each ethnic group with a particular territory. They territorialized it, which means they politicized culture. And then in each territory, they made it subject to the customary law of that tribe, because with territory, ethnic group became tribe. And in this customary law, only members of that tribe had customary rights, particularly right to land. If you were not from that tribe, if you were from a neighboring tribe, even if you had lived there your whole life, you did not have customary right to land. Now, they did not, because the colonial system had been so internalized and people had so, I'm sorry, the social science word is naturalized. They had come to think of tribes as a part of nature without understanding the significance between culture and politics, and therefore ethnic group and tribe. So the homelands continued. The customary law continued. Now, it's very interesting in South Africa in 1994. The big question was with the elections, who would have the right to vote? Citizens or all residents? The difference was huge because South Africa, as you know, has been like a magnet in Southern Africa. So migrant labor from Malawi, from Rhodesia at that time, from Mozambique, from Lesotho, numerous places were inside South Africa. They labored, they worked in South Africa. They had in fact been the backbone of the 1970s strikes and the formation of the first trade union congress for SATU. And they fought for the right to vote for everybody who lives in South Africa, citizen or not, because they are residents and because they've contributed their labor. And that is indeed what happened. Everybody voted. But then Inkatha Freedom Party came to control Ministry of Internal Affairs. Gatsha Buthelezi became the minister. And from then on, he began to introduce a whole series of administrative regulations which chipped away at the rights of residents who were not citizens and disenfranchised them over time. And it became the brunt of a kind of a propaganda campaign within the country that these people are living off the sweat of citizens. So same year, 1994-5, you began to have incidents of xenophobic violence. And the most amazing thing about xenophobic violence in South Africa is that it is not against the racial stranger. It's against the tribal stranger. Ask yourself why. Because that part of the colonial legacy was not reformed. So what I'm saying is you have to begin by reforming the political community. You have to begin by rethinking the political community before anything else, because otherwise you will just unleash the same violence with different tribes on different sites. Now, sorry for that very long answer to a short question.
No, but I mean, you are taking us to, first of all, you've shared the two very rich. And I think one of the things that it is impossible for us to cover in the book is to go into length with each of the case studies. This book, not only, I mean, it's got the overreaching, it's got a really huge scope of so many case studies. But what you begin to see is the patterns and how the patterns are developed. And you've talked us through, you've mentioned South Africa and also South Sudan and how you look at those and you work at the AU, but also very closely reading what happened in the South African moment. And South Africa, in the book, you really draw out what are the positive lessons that we can learn, what are the wonderful things that South Africa did, but also, as you have just detailed, some of the things that South Africa still needs to work on. It's also interesting for me that you look at, often when we talk about extreme violence, we really think about African countries. And then you bring these countries, and you've alluded to Germany and what happened around Nuremberg. But also you bring in the United States. And to be honest, I was reading your book at the same time that we were seeing the insurrection. And it was everything that was echoing for me was the way you spoke about the question of native, the question of settler, the question of the way political communities have been divided into permanent minorities and permanent majorities in a country that all over the world, everybody thinks of as, or used to think of as a role model for democracy. And then you take us to a case study in Israel as well, and help us to read that. And it is by looking at all of these case studies and looking at what is common, what are we seeing repeated again and again in different contexts, that for me is really persuasive when you say, it's not that they are not criminals, it's not that there are no leaders who do really, really horrible things that they should be held account for, but that we have to look at the constituency that these leaders are serving. For me, that was a huge light bulb moment. That if you don't do that, then we deal with the leaders, and then 20 years, we're back right to where we started. I see a question in the Q&A that brings me then to what I would like you to talk a little bit about. We talk about natives, we talk about settlers, we talk about permanent minorities, we talk about permanent majorities, and the way the political community is constructed around that. There is a question by Moy Shaikh who asks, Prof, why is it not possible for settlers to become natives? I understand the framing that both natives and settlers can become survivors as citizens in any particular post-colonial country. Is this impossibility not an obstacle to true citizenship? I'm going to jump off that question to just ask you, to talk us through some of these key concepts: settler, native, survivor. Those three in particular is what I think the core of the book is challenging us towards.
Well, thank you, Mshai. I mean, you began this by saying, why is the title Neither Settler Nor Native? Why not Native first? And this gives me an opportunity to explain it. In 1996, when I got a job at University of Cape Town as the A.C. Jordan Professor of African Studies, I was asked to give my inaugural. And I titled my inaugural very provocatively. Title was, Can a Settler Ever Become a Native? And I began the inaugural by straight away answering the question. I said, no, never. And the point of the inaugural was to explain this answer now. And of course, having heard it, nobody would leave the room because they wanted the explanation. And you won't find that explanation in this book, but you will find it in a set of lectures I gave at Du Bois Lectures at Harvard, which was published by Harvard University Press as a very small book called Define and Rule. And in that book, I argued that the native did not always exist.
Yes.
The native was created by the settler. The settler saw himself and herself as a bearer of progress. The settlers saw themselves as historical beings, as creators of civil law which was transportable, which they could take with them anywhere, to any part of the world. They were universal beings. And wherever they went, they defined the local population as natives. And what they meant by natives were that these were not historical beings. They were incapable of historical progress. They were identified not by history, but by geography. They were identified by place. Progress would have to be brought to them from outside. They created customary law, and customary law was not transportable like the settlers' law. Customary law only made sense within the confines of a place, the homeland, the tribal homeland. So that if you look at the system that the settler created, settlers divided their political system between two groups, settlers and natives, races and tribes. Now, races came from different places. They were not just colonizers. They were also amongst the colonized, immigrants, Indians, Chinese, Arabs, all defined as races, and all races were governed under a single law, civil law, the settlers' law. Although, of course, they were arranged as a hierarchy. Some were privileged. The whites were privileged. The non-whites were less privileged. But they were still governed under a single law. And the idea is that the law, over time, governs you under a single set of rules, no matter where you came from. And it trains you to be part of a single political community. But tribes were not governed like that. Each tribe was governed under a separate customary law. Tribes were never meant to constitute a single political community. They were always meant to constitute separate political communities. And therefore, they were always meant to be minorities each of them excluded from the civil regime. So that explanation came in that earlier book.
Yes.
Not in this book. But in this book, what I do, which, because I realized that, and my students would often ask me, say, okay, you've written these books, and now we are all convinced that this problem begins with colonialism. So tell us, how do we get out of it?
You anticipated my next question.
Is this a life imprisonment, which goes on from one generation to another? And really, I began to think of that question. In some ways, I tried to address it in my previous book. On citizen and subject. But in this book, I address it much more directly.
Yes.
And I show how in South Africa, you can actually think of two phases, one before 1970 and the other after 1970. There was resistance in both phases, but there was a real difference in the nature of resistance. Before 1970, the anti-apartheid movement was organized exactly the way the apartheid state governed the non-white population. They divided them into races: Africans, Indians, coloreds, whites. The non-whites, Africans, Indians, coloreds. And the Africans organized as African National Congress, the Indians organized as Natal Indian Congress, and the coloreds organized as Colored People's Congress. They reproduced the divisions enforced by apartheid inside the resistance movement, and they naturalized, internalized the architecture of apartheid. It began to change in the 70s. Two things happened. It really began to change because of the student movement. Black students went and joined the progressive wing of the white students, led by Biko. The black students were led by Biko. Very soon they were disillusioned. The whites may be progressive ideologically, but they were not progressive in the way they behaved inside the white organizations, even though they admitted all races. They reproduced the practices of apartheid, paternalism. They were the leaders, and the others were to be taught over time. So they left. They left, and Biko, in my mind, is the sort of the pioneer of a new way of being, because Biko went beyond race. Biko says, black is not a color. If you are oppressed, you are black. And Biko created the Black consciousness movement of Africans, coloreds, Indians using apartheid language, and replaced all those identities with one, black. Black was a new political identity. It was the political identity of the anti-apartheid movement. And since the black students left, the progressive whites were in a limbo, didn't know what to do. And the black students had gone to the townships, they were organizing, starting in Soweto. The white students, the progressive white students, not too many, a few handfuls, 60, 70, 80, they went to the hostels on the boundaries of townships.
Yeah.
And they began to organize, or when the mobilization for strikes came, they inserted themselves in this and provided technical skills as secretaries of trade unions, different kinds of technical stuff, technical support. And they provided the first role model for whites in South Africa that you could be different. Now, it took 20 years for that role model to catch because there was a black movement and there was a township revolt. And because of the township revolt, see, the revolt did not defeat the South African state, but the South African state was unable to defeat the revolt. So why did the South African state come to negotiate? Because of two reasons. One reason was that they realized that given time, the revolt would spread to the homelands. Right now, it hadn't. But there was an even more important reason. And the more important reason was that they began to realize that white intellectuals, especially Boer intellectuals, were beginning to be disillusioned with the apartheid project and were looking for another project. Student groups, clergy, even some businessmen began to make feelers. And they realized that if they lost the white intelligentsia, they would lose the white population sooner or later. So there was my interest in how the birth of a movement which would put not a blueprint, but initiatives for a different world.
Go beyond.
Yeah, beyond what existed, but necessarily contradictory, necessarily inconsistent. And of course, my job, or the job of any intellectual, was not to come out with a blueprint, but to go through this raw material and identify in it something, some consistency from which we can learn. Not that so that we reproduce it elsewhere, but so that we use it to shine a light on another place.
And so that we stop seeing each other in those boxes that we were placed in. And I really like this term that you've come up with, that we are not, even though it is important to understand the past, we're not caught up in seeing each other as all, those are the perpetrators. I am from the victim community, but you use this term survivor, which I find as a really interesting one, because you're recognizing that we've all gone through this, we've all been divided, we've all suffered, and that is the term survivor. I just want to go to a couple of questions that have come up that I do know, some of them are echoing what you're saying, and that's what I want to underline. I think I can see that Costa had started us off by asking, why is it that some Africans, even in, I think he meant even in, well, why is it that some Africans still define themselves by their nationalities? And I think that's what you've been explaining, that this sense of needing an other, even amongst Africans within African states, is what then comes up with this question of the tribes and with this question of minorities and majorities. And he reflects that this is why we talk about xenophobia. This is why xenophobia has been happening. And I think you've spoken to that. Francis Duffy takes us in a slightly different direction, asking what is it that the international community can do to avoid perpetuating a damaging cycle when these divisions have now become a political reality. And she's reflecting that often it's foreign partners, international organizations, and others who do not acknowledge. And so she's saying they may find it necessary to acknowledge and work through, well, they find it necessary to work through politicized identity divisions when they want to work with African governments. And so she's asking, is there a way that the community can avoid doing this? And then a second question I think you've also answered from Costa, which was, Prof, is what nativizes, I'm not quite sure. Costa is asking what nativizes the natives, and this question of the birthright. And I think you have engaged this question of whether the idea of the nation is a construction, is a construct, and whether it is imaginary. So perhaps if you wanted to comment to any of those questions, if you want to add, or if you want to respond to Francis about the international community, what can the international community do?
Look, I have a great interest in what existed before colonialism. And I realize at the same time, the reason I have a great interest is because, not because I think we should try and reproduce it, but I think that we can learn something from it. Yeah. I think we can learn something from how peoples lived before this arrangement was forced on us. But I realized that the material is very little, because what is written on the pre-colonial is written in response to questions which are taken from the colonial. Concepts, categories which are taken from the colonial. Category like citizen, category like sovereignty. All these are modern, current categories. And quite often people say, oh yes, we also had sovereignty before the white people came here. Are you sure? Are you sure? I mean, I now think, let's figure out what they mean by sovereignty before we want to take credit for it, because it's not a great thing. It's like private property. We had property, sure, but we had property where there were multiple rights. You know, if you have a drought, those absolute individual rights got suspended. And I mean, it's complicated, different in different places, but we didn't have a regime of absolute private property, nor a regime of sovereignty, which is absolute private property over a larger place called country. Nor did we have politicized ethnicity, tribalism, which is, you can look at empires. You can look at Shaka Zulu, and the Zulu kingdom become empire over time. And you can ask yourself whether they distinguish between people on the basis of ethnicity. And whether this distinction became a political distinction, so that the Zulu ethnicity was in a privileged position compared to others. So far, from what I have read, no. The answer is no. It very much depended on who lived within the boundaries of the kingdom. Even ethnicity. Even ethnicity was not frozen. Like, for example, you take the Amharas of Ethiopia, you take the Waswahili of East Africa, you take the Hausa in West Africa, you take the Sutu in South Africa. All of these, you take the Baganda in Uganda. The Baganda were only 4 clans initially, and today there are over 40 clans. Where did the other 40 come from? Well, those were people who were conquered, and they assimilated and became Baganda over time. So the pre-colonial culture is an assimilationist culture. If it was oppressive, it is because it was sometimes coercively assimilated, but it was not a segregationist culture. Segregationist impulse comes with colonialism. That's a huge difference. So one is not saying that pre-colonial society was without any problems. No, but there were different problems. So, I can go on, and I shouldn't go on and on.
Well, we have to close in a couple of minutes, and I notice you do not want perhaps to comment on the international community. I also have a question, which I will ask here, if the international community and also somebody wonders if you would care to comment on Uganda. And I saw that somewhere in the chat. Unfortunately, it was not in the Q&A, so it's taken me a bit of time. But it was just, yes, in Uganda, different regions, and how has this played out? And I know we may not have time for you to go into details, but 2 quick words on Uganda and the international community. And then I do have a wonderful question from Salim Lon that I want to finish with.
Look, I think the international community has to get off what they have been on for so long, which is they think of themselves as doers of good, as those who dispense charity and philanthropy, and as those who come from outside, and as they're giving you something, they're taking a selfie for publicity back home. So leave aside charity, go to responsibility. There's a historical responsibility, okay? I mean, there is now beginning of a recognition in the US, for example, with Black Lives Matter, okay? That there is a historic responsibility, which is not just an individual responsibility. It's first and foremost a state responsibility. The state has to make compensation for historical wrongs to communities which were wronged historically, not to recolonize them through charity, but to admit responsibility. So that's what I'll say about the international community. Whatever applies within the US should really applies internationally. So the second question, Uganda. What about Uganda?
I think I think the question was just a comment really in applying what you've been talking about to Uganda. It was somewhere in the chat and now I've lost that.
I mean, Uganda is, it's very interesting. When the NRM came to power in 1986, they really were the first government that was seeking to dismantle the colonial political system by dismantling the institution of chiefs and by replacing the chief with resistance committees. And along the way, they turned into the opposite. They turned resistance committees into local committees, and local committees no longer really elected or not elected for a very long time, but absorbed into the party structure. But then they recreated the colonial system of indirect rule. The NRM government, I think from the late 90s onwards, began to multiply the numbers of districts and began to split ethnic groups into multiple ethnic groups and tribalize each ethnic group separately by giving each its own district. And so turning everybody into a tiny minority. I mean, you've seen what happened in Kasese, the place of the former Rwenzururu kingdom, and the massive violence unleashed, because the dynamic generated in Western Uganda in the mountains is basically that every small minority cannot think of a future unless they think of a separate kingdom. Either you have your own kingdom or you have your own district, one of the two. So that's what Uganda is. Uganda is the colony revived.
It brings us back to that whole problem of we must get together to be able to speak so that we become a majority as well. Prof, I am so sorry that it's already 5 and we do have to finish. Just very quickly, maybe just a couple of sentences. There is a challenge by Salim Lon, and I really do want to share this. He says, You began the session with your political awakening in the 1960s and jumped to the Rwanda Genocide. I am very interested in how our African intellectuals grew in their political conscience and commitment to current ideas, ideology, etc. And I join him in that interest. I would love Mahmood Mamdani to write such a narrative. It would be immensely useful to the rest of us. Will he think of doing this?
Bwana Salim, I wish I could say yes, but I have two books before me, one that I must write before I write anything else. So I'll keep that in mind, but I cannot make it my priority right now. Thank you.
Well, Prof, it's been such a pleasure having you. When those two books are done, I will make sure that this will be the third book. So just start telling people I have 3 books, and I will do my part to make sure that Codestria publishes it. Thank you very much. This is a difficult book to talk about in such a short time, and you've done such an amazing job of doing that, of also giving us a sense of all your larger work. I cannot say thank you enough. On behalf of everybody who is on the webinar with us, I can see a lot of people saying thank you. I just want to end with just one last word from the book. And this is the very last paragraph, where you remind us that recognizing this history gives us the power to change perspectives and reality. The history of political modernity tells us those of us who identify with the nation that we have been co-opted. The nation is not inherent in us. And then you tell us, once we learn this history, we may prefer to be survivors instead. I hope that we will all take up that challenge and that we will have another opportunity to talk with you and give you some feedback on how this book has completely changed our thinking and impacted the theory. Thank you very, very much. Lillian?
Thank you, Mshai. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mshai and Prof. Mahmood. It was great having you. Thank you, our viewers. It is a pleasure always having you and joining us for our webinars. We look forward to more and to inviting you to more sessions and events. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.